Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to be here this afternoon. C'est un grand plaisir de vous voir, comme toujours. Et aussi, je voudrais mentionner au début de le discours ici that we are joined by our new High Commissioner to the UK, the Honourable William Sterling Blair. He's sitting. Do you want to stand up, Bill? This is our new High Commissioner. And you may sense the affection in my voice. Minister Blair and I have served in cabinet together in Canada for several years, and it's an absolute honor now to be here with you under your leadership here in the UK. So thank you so much for your service to our country. I also wanted to just state the obvious to begin, which is we are in a profound moment of geopolitical challenge and change, with the global economy being completely upended and the world trading order being rewired. And this is the moment that I would say, are fortunate enough to have this conversation and indeed an analysis of foreign policy, generally speaking. And on that note, perhaps I will begin with a discussion of Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos. And let's just say, everywhere I go as foreign minister, every country, every room, every foreign minister I speak with, the conversation begins with Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos. And some people call it the speech, the Carney speech, the remarks at Davos, the Carney doctrine. There are many ways we can refer to the remarks he made. On the way home, I said to the Prime Minister, now that this doctrine has been stated, the work falls on me and us, but me as foreign minister, to implement it. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Comment est-ce qu'on peut mettre en œuvre le discours, les affaires étrangères pour le Canada, mais pas seulement pour notre pays, pour le monde entier? How do we implement this doctrine now that is so important, that is gaining so much traction all over the world? And we'll come back to that question of traction towards the end of my remarks. And in particular, I want to start with the actual substance of the doctrine itself. And the substance of the doctrine is based in the principle, if you will, of principles imbued with pragmatism, or principled pragmatism. As I was leaving the speech at Davos, I saw Alexander Stubb across the way, and I was waving to him, and he said, "Values-based realism." And then we went our separate ways. And back to our trip on the way home, it was values-based realism that we talked about, variable geometry, the rules-based international order, multilateralism. But I said to the Prime Minister, these are not the terms that Canadians regularly speak in when they meet for coffee at Tim Hortons. And how do we make our foreign policy understandable to Canadians while we are implementing it? And that's what I want to talk to you about today, making this foreign policy not only understandable, but able to be implemented in an era of geopolitical challenge and change. And so let's talk about that. How do you make principled pragmatism real on the international stage? This is the work that Prime Minister Carney and I and our government are doing every single day. And we'll begin, given that you're a group of trade experts in the room, let's begin on the economic front. Let's begin in particular by talking about the work we are doing to double non-US trade over the next 10 years. And that work is proceeding with alacrity. In particular, you will note that Canada has signed more than 12 trade agreements across 4 continents in the past 6 months. This includes trade agreements with Indonesia, commitments with India for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, the signing of an FTA with ASEAN in 2026, negotiations with the Philippines, Cambodia, and Mercosur, and the list goes on. So on the economic front, our work is proceeding very quickly. And in fact, this is a strategy that I discussed with Prime Minister Carney before he was Prime Minister Carney. In fact, back in January 2025, this was his vision, and certainly diversification of trading relationships was clearly on our agenda. But even before 2025, Canada was the only G7 country that had a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. That continues to be the case. And we are layering on top bilateral and multilateral trade agreements on this foundation of diversification in trade. And we can talk in the questions about the advantages of this strategy, but certainly make no mistake, that is our strategy on the economic front. In order to grow the domestic economy, we are not only pursuing a trade diversification strategy, but we've also identified 10 national projects that will proceed immediately. We have a national projects office that is responsible for coordinating the approvals, et cetera, in order to fast track these national projects. And they include SMR facility at Darlington. It includes wind projects, LNG, and the list goes on. So I'll be happy to talk about the economic track of implementing the Carney Doctrine. Let's move briefly to talk about the defense and security track of the Carney Doctrine. And in particular, this means that internationally we'll coordinate not only in terms of our traditional alliances. NATO stands as the primary example. Canada's a founding member of NATO, but layering on top of that multilateral organization additional pragmatic alliances that serve our domestic interests and the global principles and values that we have stood for over decades and decades. Those include territorial integrity, state sovereignty, and the international rules-based order, which, while under threat, continue to be important. And so we've got a clear example in terms of defense and security track of the Davos speech in the Coalition of the Willing for Ukraine. Canada bilaterally has put on the table $25.5 billion, and Minister Blair, as he was then as the Minister of National Defense, and I before him in that role, were leading very much the charge in terms of that bilateral relationship between Canada and Ukraine. But it's not enough for the support that Ukraine needs for there to be bilateral efforts alone. And so the coalition of the willings work is extremely important in terms of continuing to be unified and shoring up the support that Ukraine needs in order to preserve its sovereignty and its territorial integrity, and I hope we'll talk about that. Another example is on Arctic security and sovereignty. Canada's key priority, both domestically and internationally, is to protect and defend the Arctic as Russian infrastructure moves further and further north towards the Arctic Circle. And Canada actually has 40% of our landmass and 70% of our coastline interfacing with the Arctic. And Prime Minister Carney's trip to Norway recently is an example of the way pragmatism works in this space. All of those countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and Canada, and Finland, care and need to work together on Arctic security. It's not just a Canadian interest, it's a multilateral interest. And this coalescence, if you will, around a particular issue is the example of pragmatism in action. It's an example of the Carney Doctrine in action. Prior to that, I formally opened a consulate in Nuuk, Greenland. One of the most poignant moments of my professional life was raising the Canadian flag at the Canadian consulate in Nuuk, because it was at that moment in time that we needed to explicitly stand for those principles that I mentioned earlier, territorial integrity and state sovereignty. And it is in that moment that I actually felt the importance of not only Canada standing for principles, but Canada standing together with other like-minded countries for those principles. And so in the Davos speech, the Prime Minister spoke about middle powers coalescing. I tend to use the term like-minded powers, given that one or another country may or may not see themselves as a middle power, but that should not detract from the shared values and intentionality that we have. And so it is with our work on the international stage, we will continue to work together with like-minded countries in order to pursue values, whether it's in the economic sphere or whether it's in the defense and security sphere itself. Now, I'd like to turn to the Canada-UK relationship for a moment. And that is simply to say that Canada and the UK are natural partners. The UK is Canada's third largest single country trading partner for goods and services in 2025. It is much more than a trading partner, however. Shared values, deep historical roots, members of the Commonwealth, and true partners. And when I was having breakfast this morning with Secretary Lamy and Vice Prime Minister, of course, Deputy Prime Minister, I said very few countries can sit across the table from each other like we are today and build on a very strong foundation in order to further the bilateral relationship and the work we are doing together around the world. That relationship is so important in these moments of challenge and change. And so let me simply conclude by saying, through all of this work, all of these moments where we are responding pragmatically let us not forget the principles that are driving this work and that will continue to inform and be present in this pragmatism. Canada's respect for human rights, for international law, for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, for environmental sustainability, for gender equality, and the list goes on. Our principles are not absent. They are present more than ever, and they will be reflected in our pragmatic policy. This is the moment where we need to ensure, as Prime Minister Carney mentioned in his speech, that we stand for our principles and we do so individually and collectively with our work together with like-minded countries. And I'll close by saying that a country's greatness lies not only in delivering and in the pursuit of excellence for the domestic, economic, and security resilience towards which it strives, but also in the leadership that it plays internationally in pursuing objectives that benefit the global community writ large. This is Canada's mission. This is our moment to lead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. And I've spoken with many Canadian colleagues, friends, experts who also remind me that the Davos speech was not the beginning of this initiative, but in fact has been a project Canada has had for many years now and is accelerating in much more public and consolidated ways.
So I'm consistent with what you've heard. That's
absolutely
always a good thing.
Absolutely. But one of the questions that I've been getting is, in this vision, it's a broad vision of middle powers, of like-minded partners, as you say. In your view, who are those most critical partners? Are there specific countries or institutions or regions that animate the strategy for you, or is it a variable geometry, bespoke depending on the topic or the issue, that will then pull together specific countries and institutions in service of that aim?
So the key to answering that question lies in the word pragmatism. Mm-hmm. Pragmatism is reflective of decisions that are made as necessity calls for, given the situation.
Yes.
And you can see that in the work that the Prime Minister Carney is doing with the Nordic Five, and indeed, last August, I was in Finland saying to the Nordic Five, secured an invitation to Finland to go to talk to them about the importance of Arctic security for all of us. And indeed, since that meeting with the Nordic Five, I have then taken up the conversation with Mark Rutte at NATO to say this needs to be a priority for NATO as well, not only member countries of NATO individually. So to answer your question, it depends on the issue, and different alliances will form given the particular issue at stake. Arctic security is a good example. Another example, a little bit more geographically afar, is on information technology and AI. On the sidelines of the G20 summit in South Africa, Prime Minister Carney, Prime Minister Albanese, and Prime Minister Modi decided to strike what is called the ACITI, agreement between the three countries on information technology and data sharing. This is fundamentally an example of the Carney Doctrine in action. Our domestic interests and international objectives would be served by moving towards an agreement that was voiced in an MOU at the time towards reaching a particular goal vis-a-vis information technology. And so we're going to, right now, on the sidelines of the G20, we're going to sign a document. Didn't go through the whole system of bureaucratic red lines and changes and back and forth that you see and have traditionally seen in diplomacy. It was very much leader level driven. And that's just another example of the pragmatism at stake that Canada is exemplifying.
And so to take this example of AI and emerging technology, there's such significant promise, but also a lot of risk involved. Major players in the US, in China, several in Europe as well. How is Canada thinking about its approach to sovereign AI, where the opportunities are, and then what are the risks you are trying to guard against?
Well, of course, Canada is a leader in artificial intelligence. Geoffrey Hinton and others have led the charge from a Canadian perspective across universities and think tanks within our country. And so we have a Minister of Artificial Intelligence, the first such minister in Canadian history, and we are pursuing aggressively a policy of ensuring that AI is at the forefront of not only our policy relating to tech, but also our economic policy, our energy policy, and our work internationally. So yes, sovereign AI is at the very forefront of Canadian policy, but I should say, across any of these subjects we're talking about today, we can no longer think in silos when it comes to the discharge of ministerial obligations, but also our domestic and foreign policy. Security and defense is tied very closely to economic policy, which is tied very closely to our energy policy, which in turn is tied very closely to our work with AI and tech. It is a puzzle that needs to be kept closely together, and if we think in silos, we will not be as successful as we need to be.
You raised energy, and if the Carney Doctrine is in service of coalescing around a problem, energy is a problem this month in very acute ways as a result of the US and Israeli strikes on Iran. How does the Carney Doctrine apply on energy? How is Canada thinking about diversifying its partnerships in trade relations beyond the US and the hydrocarbon space? What does this doctrine say on the energy space, both in the near term, how it addresses skyrocketing oil and gas prices and the Iran conflict, but then longer term, what it looks like for blooming demand as AI build-out continues?
So every country I visit, without exception, asks me about Canada's energy and critical mineral resources, period.
We didn't disappoint you here, I hope.
And the reality is that Canada's an energy superpower. And this was the case historically, not just since the unfortunate, and I would say illegal, closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And what we are doing with countries around the world now, and this is another example of pragmatic and principled foreign policy, is to say, how can we cooperate with you on energy and critical minerals? And the Prime Minister, in fact, at the G7 in Kananaskis, led the work that was signed on by the G7 to stabilize supply chains in critical minerals, to ensure that there is collaborative work that is occurring given the volatility in the supply chain for critical minerals. And on energy, listen, name your source of energy, that is. LNG, clean and conventional across the board, nuclear, I mentioned Darlington, but of course, Canada is well known for the CANDU nuclear reactors. I've just come from Turkey, for example. We have such reactors present all over the world, including next door to Turkey and Romania. Wind power, solar power, and this is Canada's moment, indeed, to continue to lead in the area of energy in all its forms.
And what we heard in Davos was also a very pointed set of remarks about the United States, right? About the kind of causes or some of the intervening events over the last year plus that have animated this strategy and accelerated it, and indeed broadened its appeal to other middle powers or like-minded countries. What is that relationship with the U.S. right now? Where are the areas of ongoing cooperation? What are the risks you're seeing over the next years?
That's a really nuanced question, and I appreciate that framing, because the relationship is complex and spans a number of areas, not only trade, and 85% of our trade passes through the USMCA, tariff-free. And I'll come back to trade in a minute, but trade, defense and security, under NORAD, the Canada and the United States together defend the North American continent, including the Canadian Arctic. People-to-people ties, so great. I say this as I, reference some of my own family who live and work in the United States. This is commonplace for there to be high integration between the populations of both countries. And so across these many areas, you see a very integrated relationship. And it's really impossible to disentangle the relationship. And so in this moment where we see the world trading order being rewired, what Canada is doing is saying we have our own distinct path. And we are charting that path to double non-US trade over 10 years. And we are moving quickly in order to do so. We are ensuring as well that we're removing internal barriers to trade. You know that we are a country of 13 provincial and territorial jurisdictions. Well, there has to be free trade within our country, not only with other countries around the world. And so this is a very nuanced relationship, but we have, without question, charted a course in furtherance of Canada's domestic economic resilience.
And how does this strategy, where does China fit in this strategy? How is Canada thinking about, my read of this doctrine was that it was, it was all of the countries except the US and except China, right? But surely these middle powers, Canada, have very deep ties to the United States, have growing ties to China. Can you speak a bit about how you are seeing your country's evolving approach to China and how middle powers might feed into that, and what the limits of those partnerships and the risks are there too?
Another great question. So the work I'm doing as foreign minister is to ensure that we have diplomatic relationships with countries around the world, especially where there is mutual economic benefit to be had. And in the case of China, for legitimate reasons, there had been a lessening or loosening of the relationship, despite the fact that China is our second largest trading partner. And the trade frictions between our countries had grown, especially after we followed the United States lead and imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EV. And they retaliated with tariffs on our canola and other industries. And so I went to China and India, in fact, in October to begin the conversation about how do we address these trade frictions, and how do we chart a path forward that respects concerns that we naturally have in the relationship, but also that addresses some of the economic friction that have been deeply and negatively affecting certain Canadian sectors. We are a country of agricultural producers, for example, and our agri-food industry had been very heavily hit by those retaliatory or those tariffs by China. And so what we were able to do, Prime Minister Carney's visit to see President Xi in January was a mark of pragmatically addressing the issues, ensuring that those trade frictions were resolved, and also, as you said in the last part of your question, allowing the people-to-people ties that are strong between our two countries to grow, with China agreeing to allow visa-free travel for Canadian citizens to China. So that's the example of nuanced foreign policy that addresses particular issues in the bilateral relationship in a way that benefits the Canadian economy.
I have many more questions for you, but I know the audience does too. So I will stop there for now. As you ask your question, we will have microphones come to you. You can remain seated. Please state your name and your affiliation, and ensure your question is indeed a question. In the back.
Hello, Minister. I'm Emily Lydgate from the UK Trade Policy Observatory. So picking up on the point about kind of internal political tensions in Canada, as I'm sure you know, the UK and Canada suspended negotiations towards their free trade agreement comprehensive update in 2024, largely because of agricultural market access concerns. So I'm curious if in the wake of the Davos speech, there's a fresh impetus of energy towards making progress in this realm. And if not, is that a failure of middle power cooperation? How can we contextualize that?
Yes, there is all work being done to ensure that we can move even closer together as trading partners and partners on many other issues. It is in keeping with our bilateral relationship to move towards resolution of these issues, and that work is underway.
Next in the middle here, please.
Thank you. Lucy, and I work for Department for Business and Trade. My question draws on what you're saying about AI. I think it's kind of a commonly accepted thing that the race to artificial superintelligence is being dominated by the US and China, and eventually one of them, if that is a possibility, will win. I was really struck by your piece on kind of like-minded alliances. Is there a way that the like-minded alliances can quickly come together and join this race that's increasingly being dominated?
Well, yes, and I would say that that's happening right now as we speak. The example that I gave you of the ACITI is one powerful means by which countries, in this case, India, Canada, and Australia, are going to come together on these issues. We've been working with a number of other countries as well, and in particular, our Minister of AI, Evan Solomon, has taken on an international role for this very purpose, signing MOUs with countries like Germany in order to ensure that we are working collectively. So taking a step back from your question and tying it to the Davos speech, I will say that Canada is working urgently with other powers, like-minded countries, in order to address the speed at which this particular file is moving, but also to ensure that we have an AI policy and a foundation that serves other areas of the Canadian economy as well. So at all times, we see our work internationally as being tied to domestic economic and security objectives. And in this respect, I want to reiterate that when I came in to this role last May 13th, it was a Friday actually, and on that day, I said to myself that foreign policy is no longer an item unto itself, where diplomacy is only about forging international relationships. Our forging of international relationships continues to be important, make no mistake. But those relationships are tied to domestic economic and security objectives. And in that way, we are talking about a holistic government policy across AI, energy, defense and security, and the economic objectives of our country. Thank you.
Center here, gentleman with the tie.
Thanks. Joshua Kettle, Department for Business and Trade. Canada has been a big supporter of the CPTPP EU dialogue. What potential do you see for that grouping, and what would you like that grouping to achieve in the long term?
So the reason I hesitate is that the answer is very much consistent with what we are trying to do internationally. It's not only about having individual spheres of free trade. It is also about ensuring that like-minded countries can join those free trade groupings. And so another example would be Prime Minister Carney's work with the EU and with the ASEAN to bring these parties together, or the EU and CPTPP. Another example. And people are looking, I will say, to Canada, especially under Prime Minister Carney's leadership, to say, can you act as an interlocutor for us in these conversations? And again, as I concluded my remarks by saying, this is a moment for us as a country to work with other like-minded countries on trade, on freer trade, as well as on defense and security interests. And this gets back to the question, your very first question, which is, what does pragmatism mean in this moment? Is it an identified grouping of countries? Well, no, it's not an identified grouping of countries. It's an issue-by-issue analysis, and for sure, there are countries that will be consistently at the forefront of that work, and I would say the UK is one of them.
Let's go to the row behind, please.
Hi, my name is Mark Jones, I work for Reuters here in London. You touched on it a couple of times, defence. Can you tell us, Canada seems to be taking the reins with this idea for a defence bank. Can you tell us how that's progressing, and ultimately who will join you in it if it happens, and if not, why aren't people joining you?
The DSRB, DRSB, I believe, is the Defense Resilience and Security Bank. And that's the acronym. And the group is actually meeting in Montreal on Monday to begin the negotiations for a charter that would underpin the governance and functioning of this bank. And akin to, but not identical to, other development banks that we have seen historically, the goal of the bank is to ensure that countries are pooling capital together to assist the defense industries in various countries in growth that is necessary given demand for the products that these companies would be producing. Canada itself is a country where over 90% of corporations are small to medium-sized enterprises. Those companies don't typically have extensive capital to grow in the way that demand currently requires. And so the bank is very much an attempt to pool capital in a coordinated manner in order to ensure the growth of small, medium, and large enterprises in an era where demand requires the products that they're putting together. And we saw demand, in fact, begin to grow significantly in the aftermath of the February 24, 22 further invasion of Ukraine by Russia, where at the Defense Contact Group meetings in Ramstein, you'll remember, High Commissioner, that we saw countries putting on the table 155 millimeter ammunition and howitzers or what have you, but there was a limited supply of defense and industrial equipment. And the question was very much, how are we going to have interoperable equipment, but also how are we going to grow the defense industries in our respective countries? And this very much is a follow-on from those types of conversations. And so Canada's coming to the table in these conversations as a country that believes in coordination and collaboration on these and other matters. We are a country that has committed $80 billion in our last federal budget to the Canadian Armed Forces and the defense industry. And we indeed have a new defense industrial strategy that sees the growth of the defense industry in Canada as a domestic priority. And this bank is a means by which we will mold our domestic economic and defense and security objectives with the overall view that we have internationally, that we can work more strongly in a coordinated fashion internationally than we can alone.
We have unfortunately come to the end of our time together today, but you have given us so much to think about and many different threads to watch as time goes on across so many different domains. And so I would ask all of you to join me in thanking Minister Anand for being with us today.